No one ever sits you down and explains how your mind will be trained. There is no ceremony, no warning, no moment where someone says, "From now on, the way you think will quietly determine the kind of life you attract." It just happens. Slowly, silently, repeatedly. Most people believe their life is shaped by big decisions, where they studied, who they married, what job they took, but the truth is far less dramatic and far more unsettling. Your life is shaped by what your mind learned to repeat when no one was watching. Long before you ever tried to change your life, your mind was already being trained, not intentionally, not consciously, but efficiently. And that training never stopped. You did not wake up one day suddenly thinking the way you do. You didn't randomly develop the fears you carry, the doubts you replay, the patterns you can't seem to break. They were installed, not by a single event, but by repetition. A comment made casually, repeated internally, a disappointment that lingered longer than it should have, an environment that rewarded silence instead of curiosity, a routine that replaced awareness with survival. None of it felt dangerous at the time. That's the problem. The most powerful training never announces itself as training. Think about how a habit forms. No one becomes skilled at something overnight. They become skilled through repetition, exposure, and normalization. The mind works the same way. Every thought you repeat becomes easier to think again. Every emotional reaction you rehearse becomes faster the next time. Every belief you don't question becomes structural. Eventually, it stops feeling like a belief. It feels like truth. And once something feels like truth, the mind defends it, even if it hurts you, especially if it's familiar. This is how invisible training works. You don't train your mind to attract what you want. You train it to return to what it knows. And what it knows is shaped by your past, your environment, and your emotional habits, not your goals. Most people assume that attraction is intentional. They think, if I want a better life, I just need better thoughts. But wanting is weak compared to conditioning. Your mind does not follow desire. It follows familiarity. That is why people attract situations they say they don't want. They don't want them, but their mind recognizes them. And recognition feels safe. Safety is one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. The mind is not designed to make you happy. It is designed to keep you safe. Safe does not mean fulfilled. Safe does not mean successful. Safe does not mean peaceful. Safe means predictable. And predictability is often built in discomfort. If chaos was normal, calm feels suspicious. If struggle was rewarded, ease feels undeserved. If silence was dangerous, stillness feels threatening. So the mind pulls you back, not because it hates you, but because it was trained to survive, not to expand. This is why change feels unnatural at first, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity triggers resistance. You might believe you are choosing your thoughts, but most of the time, your thoughts are choosing you. They arrive already formed, already rehearsed, already charged with emotion. By the time you notice them, they've already influenced your mood, your posture, your energy. This is not weakness, this is conditioning. Your mind has been trained by what you heard repeatedly, what you observed growing up, what you were praised or punished for, what you learned to suppress, what you learned to tolerate, what you learned to expect. Every environment is a classroom, even the ones that never meant to teach you anything. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Your current life is not random. It is the natural result of the mental training you absorbed over time. Not your intelligence, not your talent, not your potential, your patterns. You attract opportunities that match your expectations. You tolerate relationships that match your self-image. You repeat behaviors that match your emotional defaults. Not because you consciously choose them, but because your mind recognizes them as normal. This is why two people can face the same circumstances and experience completely different lives. One sees threat, the other sees challenge. One collapses, the other adapts, not because one is smarter, but because their minds were trained differently. Your mind learned how to interpret reality before you ever questioned it, and interpretation is everything. A neutral event happens. The mind assigns meaning. That meaning triggers emotion. Emotion drives behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce belief, and the cycle tightens. This is the loop most people live inside without ever seeing it. Invisible training does not require trauma. It only requires repetition. A small disappointment repeated enough times becomes identity. A quiet comparison repeated daily becomes self-doubt. A constant background of urgency becomes anxiety. A life lived without intention becomes drift. Drift is one of the most dangerous states of the mind because it feels normal. When the mind drifts, it stops asking questions, it stops challenging assumptions, it stops choosing direction. It reacts instead of decides, consumes instead of creates, survives instead of lives. And here is where attraction becomes inevitable. A drifting mind attracts a drifting life. Unclear goals, weak boundaries, missed timing, chronic dissatisfaction without a clear cause. Not dramatic failure, just quiet stagnation. Most people don't fail loudly, they fade quietly, and they don't even notice when it starts. Your mind is constantly being trained by what you allow it to consume. Conversations, media, news, comparisons, internal dialogue. You may think you are just passing time, but your mind is recording patterns. What feels normal, what feels threatening, what feels possible, what feels unrealistic. And the mind believes repetition more than intention. You can want a different life all you want. But if your mental diet contradicts that desire, the training wins. Every time. This is why affirmations fail for so many people. Not because affirmations are useless, but because they are outnumbered. 10 minutes of positive language cannot undo 16 hours of unconscious reinforcement. The mind doesn't change through moments. It changes through environments. Your inner environment matters as much as your external one. What you repeatedly say to yourself matters more than what others say about you, but only if you are aware of it. Most people are not. The inner voice becomes background noise, so familiar that it feels like you, but it's not you. It's trained thought. At some point, the mind stops distinguishing between past and present. Old disappointments feel current, old fears feel relevant, old narratives feel permanent, and so the future is filtered through yesterday's lens. This is how people attract the same life in different forms, different city, different job, different relationship. Same emotional patterns, same outcomes. They think they are unlucky. They think they are broken. They think something is wrong with them. But what's actually happening is far simpler. They are loyal to a training they never chose. Your mind is loyal to what it was trained on, even if that training hurts you, even if it limits you, even if it keeps you small. And here is the hardest part to accept. No one is coming to retrain it for you. Not a partner, not a job, not success, not money. External change does not override internal conditioning. It exposes it. When opportunity arrives, conditioning decides whether you accept it, sabotage it, or delay it. When responsibility increases, conditioning decides whether you grow or retreat. When pressure appears, conditioning decides whether you rise or collapse. This is why some people self-sabotage at the edge of change, not because they don't want more, but because more threatens their identity. The mind asks silently, who will I be if this works? And if the answer is unfamiliar, the mind resists. Attraction is not mystical, it is mechanical. Your mind projects expectations. Your behavior follows those expectations. Your environment responds accordingly. So when people say, "I don't know why this keeps happening to me," the answer is often because your mind was trained to expect it. This is not blame. This is clarity. Blame keeps you stuck. Clarity gives you leverage. You cannot change what you don't see, and most people never see their training. They only feel the consequences. This is why awareness is the first real shift. Not motivation, not inspiration, awareness. Seeing the pattern without judging yourself for having it. Your mind did exactly what it was trained to do. Now the question becomes unavoidable. If your mind was trained, it can be retrained. But retraining requires something most people avoid: responsibility without shame, not guilt, not self-attack. Responsibility. The recognition that what happens inside you matters more than what happens to you. This is where the journey truly begins. Not with changing your life, but with changing what trains your mind every day. Because until you do, your mind will continue attracting a life that feels familiar, even when it hurts. And here is the quiet truth that sits beneath everything you've just heard. Your mind is already training you every day. The only question is whether it's training you consciously or unconsciously. This is not the end of the first block. This is the foundation. In the next block, we will go deeper into something even more uncomfortable. Why the mind often resists change, why it clings to what it says it hates, and why people unconsciously attract the very life they are trying to escape. That is where resistance reveals itself. And once you see that, you can no longer unsee it. At some point, most people reach a confusing conclusion. They say, "I'm trying to change. I'm doing the work. I don't want this life anymore." And yet, nothing seems to move. Or worse, the same patterns return. Different faces, different settings, same outcome. That contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. The mind does not respond to what you say you want. It responds to what you are organized around emotionally. This is where resistance enters the picture. And resistance is not what most people think it is. People assume resistance means effort. They believe that if something feels hard, it's because they're resisting it. But psychological resistance works in the opposite direction. You resist change, not by pushing against it, but by clinging to what feels familiar, even when that familiarity hurts. The mind forms attachments not to happiness, but to identity. And identity is built from repetition, not intention. If you have spent years thinking a certain way, feeling a certain way, reacting a certain way, that pattern becomes who you are, not consciously, structurally. So when you attempt to change your life, your mind doesn't evaluate the change based on logic. It evaluates it based on threat. Not threat to safety, but threat to identity. Change asks a dangerous question: who will you be if this works? And if the answer is unclear, the mind tightens. This is why people resist what they consciously desire. They say they want freedom, but feel uneasy when responsibility increases. They say they want peace, but feel restless in stillness. They say they want clarity, but avoid silence. Because clarity removes excuses, and excuses protect identity. The mind often prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar peace, not because pain is pleasant, but because it is known. Think about how many people stay in situations they openly complain about, jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, lifestyles that exhaust them. They talk about leaving. They imagine something better, but they stay, not because they are weak, but because leaving would require becoming someone unfamiliar. Resistance is loyalty to the known self, even when the known self is unhappy. This is why attraction feels cruel at times. You don't attract what you admire. You attract what you tolerate. You attract what matches your emotional baseline. The mind does not chase relief. It preserves equilibrium. and equilibrium is shaped by history. If stress was normal, calm feels wrong. If chaos was common, order feels boring. If disappointment was frequent, hope feels dangerous. So when something good appears, the mind questions it. It searches for flaws. It anticipates loss. It prepares for disappointment, and in doing so, it quietly invites it. This is not superstition. This is conditioning. Your nervous system is not interested in dreams. It is interested in regulation. It wants to maintain what it recognizes as normal, even if that normal is dissatisfaction. This is why people self-sabotage right before progress, not at the beginning, but at the threshold. The closer you get to something unfamiliar, the louder the resistance becomes. Sudden doubt, sudden fatigue, sudden loss of motivation, sudden rationalizations, all of it feels reasonable, logical, justified. But it is not logic, it is identity preservation. The mind says, be careful, don't rush. Now is not the time. You might fail. And it sounds wise, but underneath, there is fear of disorientation. If you've identified as someone who struggles, success threatens your narrative. If you've identified as someone who survives, thriving feels unsafe. If you've identified as someone who endures, ease feels suspicious. So the mind creates resistance, not through panic, but through delay. Delay is the most elegant form of self-sabotage. It feels responsible, it feels mature, it feels patient, but it quietly keeps you where you are. This is how people attract what they resist. They resist growth, but attract stagnation. They resist responsibility, but attract limitation. They resist uncertainty, but attract boredom. Resistance does not repel outcomes, it organizes them. Your emotional posture matters more than your conscious intention. If you move through life bracing, life responds with friction. If you move through life doubting, life responds with hesitation. If you move through life guarded, life responds with distance. This is not punishment. It is mirroring. Your internal stance becomes external experience, not instantly, but inevitably. Many people misunderstand attraction because they focus on outcomes. They want better results, but they avoid changing the internal posture that produces those results. They want confidence, but keep rehearsing doubt. They want connection, but protect themselves from vulnerability. They want meaning, but avoid responsibility. So the mind stays conflicted, pulled between desire and fear, and conflict creates stagnation. The mind cannot move forward while protecting the past. At some point, one must be released. But releasing an identity feels like loss, even when that identity is painful, because it is familiar. This is why people grieve change before it even happens. They mourn the version of themselves they are about to outgrow. And if they don't recognize that grief, they retreat. Resistance often disguises itself as realism. I'm just being practical. I'm just being cautious. I'm just being honest. But honesty without awareness becomes limitation. The mind confuses fear with wisdom, especially when fear has been rehearsed for years. And here is a truth that feels uncomfortable at first. The mind often resists change because change removes blame. As long as life is unfair, as long as circumstances are the problem, as long as the world is against you, identity remains intact. But when responsibility enters the picture, excuses collapse, and that is terrifying. Responsibility does not mean fault. It means authorship. It means recognizing that your internal world shapes your external experience. And once you see that, you can no longer hide behind randomness. This is why many people reject this idea, not because it's false, but because it demands too much honesty. Resistance also comes from secondary benefits, benefits people rarely admit. Struggle can bring sympathy. Struggle can bring identity. Struggle can bring belonging, sometimes even purpose. If you have built your self-image around endurance, who are you without the struggle? If people know you as the one who always has it hard, who are you when it gets easier? The mind protects these roles, because roles provide structure, even painful ones. This is why attraction feels paradoxical. You attract what you emotionally commit to, even if you verbally reject it. The mind does not speak language, it speaks behavior, patterns, reactions. So when someone says, "I don't want this anymore," the real question becomes, what are you still practicing internally? Because practice is training, and training is attraction. The mind is not impressed by declarations. It is impressed by consistency. This is why people can meditate in the morning and spiral at night. Why they feel inspired for moments and discouraged by default. Default state is destiny, not peak moments. Your baseline emotional state becomes your signal, and life responds to the signal, not the intention. This is where many people feel helpless. They think, "So I'm trapped by my past?" No, but you are influenced by it, until you interrupt it consciously. Interruption requires awareness of resistance, not fighting it, not judging it, seeing it. When resistance appears, it is information. It tells you where identity is attached. It reveals where growth threatens familiarity. Instead of asking, "Why is this hard?" ask, "What part of me is being challenged?" This shifts the relationship with resistance. It stops being an enemy. It becomes a signal. The mind resists what it has not rehearsed, so it returns to what it knows over and over again. This is how people attract the same relationships with different names, the same conflicts in different jobs, the same dissatisfaction in different cities. They think the world keeps changing, but internally nothing has. Change does not begin with replacing circumstances. It begins with loosening identity, and that is uncomfortable, because identity feels like safety, even when it's limiting. The moment you stop resisting growth, life does not suddenly become easy, but it becomes honest. And honesty is the doorway to alignment. Attraction shifts not when you force positivity, but when you stop defending limitation. This is why people who let go of old identities often experience rapid change, not because they manifested, but because they stopped resisting what was already possible. Your mind is incredibly powerful, but it is also incredibly loyal. It will protect who you believe yourself to be, even against your own desires, and until that loyalty is examined, attraction remains unconscious. This is the deeper layer beneath struggle. Not bad luck, not lack of effort, but unexamined identity. Once you see this, something shifts, not immediately, but permanently. You stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I still attached to?" That question is dangerous because it leads to responsibility, and responsibility changes everything. In the next block, we will move into the turning point, not theory, not diagnosis, but authority, how to reclaim control over the mind, how to stop drifting, how to interrupt unconscious training, and how responsibility, when embraced without shame, becomes power. This is where resistance begins to loosen, and once it does, attraction changes direction. Pause here. Read this block slowly. Notice what feels uncomfortable. Notice what resonates. Notice what resists. When you're ready, tell me. Pode continuar para o bloco 3. We move forward only when you say so. There is a moment in every internal journey that changes the tone completely. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with confidence. It arrives with responsibility. Up until now, everything you've heard may have felt uncomfortable, but distant. You could nod along. You could recognize patterns. You could see yourself in the descriptions. But recognition alone does not change anything. Awareness without authority still leaves the mind in control. Most people become aware of their patterns long before they gain control over them. They know they overthink, they know they procrastinate, they know they sabotage themselves, and yet they still obey the same thoughts. This is the gap most people never cross. The gap between seeing the problem and governing it. Authority over the mind does not come from insight, it comes from decision. And decision is not emotional, it is structural. The moment you reclaim authority is the moment you stop negotiating with every thought that appears. You stop treating your inner dialogue as truth. You stop asking permission from fear. This is where many people hesitate, because they confuse authority with force. They imagine control means suppression, domination, aggression. It does not. Authority is not about silencing the mind. It is about deciding which voice gets to lead. Most people live as if every thought deserves a response. Every doubt gets attention. Every fear gets analysis. Every hesitation gets debate. This is not wisdom. This is submission. The mind produces thoughts the way the lungs produce breath. Not every breath needs interpretation. Not every thought needs obedience. Authority begins when you recognize this simple truth. You are not required to agree with your thoughts. This sounds obvious, until you try it. The moment a thought appears that says, "You can't handle this," most people respond automatically. They feel tension, they slow down, they retreat. Not because the thought was true, but because it was obeyed. Authority is the ability to pause between thought and action. That pause is where power lives. Without it, you are reactive. With it, you are deliberate. Reclaiming authority does not mean thoughts stop appearing. Fear will still show up. Doubt will still whisper. Old narratives will still try to return. The difference is not their absence. It is their influence. An untrained mind believes every thought is a message. A trained mind treats thoughts as signals, information, not commands. This distinction changes everything. Think of the mind like a council. Many voices, many opinions, many warnings. Authority is not removing voices. It is appointing a leader. Most people never appoint one. They let the loudest voice win. And the loudest voice is usually fear. Fear is loud because it evolved to be. It is designed to capture attention. That does not make it wise. Authority requires a conscious shift, from emotional leadership to intentional leadership. This is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. Because once you realize you can choose, you can no longer hide behind habit. Responsibility is frightening, not because it is heavy, but because it removes excuses. As long as your mind just happens to you, you are innocent. Once you reclaim authority, you become accountable, and accountability is uncomfortable. But it is also empowering. Most people would rather remain innocent and powerless than accountable and free. Authority over the mind begins with one radical move. You stop identifying with every internal reaction. You observe thoughts instead of merging with them. You notice emotions instead of drowning in them. You recognize patterns instead of defending them. This creates distance, and distance creates choice. Choice is the foundation of discipline, and discipline is the foundation of attraction. Without discipline, attraction is accidental. With discipline, attraction becomes directional. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think it is about force, about willpower, about intensity. But real discipline is quiet. It is consistency without drama. It is doing what you decided, even when your emotions disagree. The mind resists discipline because discipline threatens comfort. Comfort is what the mind was trained to protect. So when you begin to reclaim authority, expect resistance, not externally, internally. Thoughts like, "This is too rigid. This is unrealistic. You're being too hard on yourself." These thoughts are not insights, they are negotiations. The mind is trying to renegotiate leadership. Authority is not cruelty, but it is firm. You do not argue with every thought. You acknowledge it, and you decide anyway. This is why motivation fails so often. Motivation is emotional leadership, and emotions are unstable. Authority does not depend on how you feel. It depends on what you've decided. When you reclaim authority, you stop asking, "What do I feel like doing?" and start asking, "What aligns with who I am becoming?" Identity becomes the reference point, not mood. This is where most people stumble. Because they have never consciously chosen an identity, they have reacted into one. Authority requires definition. You cannot lead the mind if you don't know where you're going. This is why drift feels so powerful. Without direction, the mind fills the gap with fear, habit, and comfort. Reclaiming authority means defining standards, standards for thought, standards for attention, standards for reaction. Standards do not require perfection, they require consistency. For example, you do not need to eliminate negative thoughts, you need to stop following them. A thought appears, you notice it, you choose not to act on it. That is authority. At first, this feels artificial, unnatural, even fake. That's normal. You are interrupting training that has been running for years. The mind protests because it prefers automation. Automation is efficient, but it is also limiting. Authority is inefficient at first. It requires effort, attention, repetition. But repetition is how the mind learns, just as it learned fear, just as it learned doubt. You are not breaking the mind. You are retraining it. This is where people quit, not because it's impossible, but because it's uncomfortable. Authority feels lonely at first, because you are no longer moving with the crowd inside your head. You are choosing direction over agreement. And here is a critical truth. Authority over the mind does not mean immediate results. It means internal alignment. The external world may not change quickly, but the internal war begins to quiet. You stop fighting yourself, and that alone changes how you show up. When you reclaim authority, your posture changes, your speech slows, your reactions soften, not because you are passive, but because you are grounded. Grounded people attract differently, not through force, through presence. This is why authority precedes attraction. Before life responds differently, you respond differently. You stop chasing outcomes. You start embodying direction. Most people try to attract without authority. They visualize without discipline. They affirm without structure. They hope without identity. Authority gives substance to intention. Once authority is reclaimed, the mind begins to reorganize. Not immediately, but steadily. Old patterns lose urgency. Fear loses volume. Doubt loses credibility, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer in charge. This is the turning point, the moment where the mind stops training you unconsciously and starts being trained deliberately. And that changes what you attract, not magically, mechanically. Your actions become consistent, your boundaries become clearer, your energy becomes stable. Stability is attractive, not chaos. This is why people with authority over themselves often appear calm, not because life is easy, but because their inner leadership is clear. They do not need to convince. They do not need to rush. They do not need to explain. They decide, and decision organizes behavior. Behavior shapes experience. Experience reinforces identity. This is the new loop. In the next block, we will move from authority to training, from decision to practice, from leadership to conditioning, because authority alone is not enough. It must be reinforced daily, or the old training returns. That is where deliberate mental training begins, and where attraction truly shifts. Pause here. Notice what changed in tone. This block was not comforting. It was stabilizing. When you're ready, say, "Pode continuar para o bloco por." We move forward only with your confirmation. Authority over the mind is the turning point. But authority alone does not last without training. This is where most people fall back. They decide, they feel strong, they feel clear, and then life happens. Old habits return, old thoughts creep in, old reactions reappear, not because authority failed, but because authority was not reinforced. The mind does not change through insight, it changes through repetition. Just as it learned fear, just as it learned doubt, just as it learned to drift, it must now learn direction. Training the mind is not dramatic. It is subtle, it is repetitive, it is often boring, and that is precisely why it works. Most people wait for emotional readiness. They wait to feel motivated. They wait to feel confident. They wait to feel aligned. But the mind does not follow feelings. Feelings follow behavior. Training begins when behavior no longer depends on emotion. This is the great misunderstanding about change. People think they must feel different to act different. In reality, acting different is what teaches the mind to feel differently. The mind learns through experience, not explanation. This is why reading, listening, and understanding are not enough. They inform. They do not condition. Conditioning happens when a thought is replaced consistently, when attention is redirected deliberately, when reaction is interrupted repeatedly. Training the mind begins with attention. Attention is the most powerful currency you possess. Whatever you give attention to grows, not metaphorically, neurologically. Your brain strengthens the pathways you use most. Thoughts you repeat become default routes. Emotions you rehearse become baseline states. So the first rule of mental training is simple. Do not let your attention wander unchecked. This does not mean controlling every thought. That would be impossible. It means controlling what you engage with. A thought appears. You notice it. You choose whether to follow it. That choice, repeated hundreds of times, retrains the mind. Most people believe their mind is loud because it is broken. It is loud because it has never been directed. Direction quiets the mind, not force. The second element of training is language. The words you use internally shape perception, not because words are magical, but because they frame reality. If you describe everything as a problem, the mind learns to see obstacles. If you describe everything as pressure, the mind learns to brace. If you describe everything as unfair, the mind learns helplessness. Training the mind requires changing the language of interpretation, not to deny reality, but to choose a usable frame. For example, "This is overwhelming" creates paralysis. "This requires structure" creates agency. "This always happens to me" creates resignation. "This is feedback" creates learning. The mind does not argue with interpretation. It organizes around it. The third element of training is identity reinforcement. Identity is the deepest training layer. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your identity. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, success feels temporary. If you see yourself as someone who survives, thriving feels foreign. Training the mind means reinforcing identity intentionally, not who you were, who you are becoming. This does not mean pretending. It means practicing alignment. Identity is not declared once. It is rehearsed daily. Every small decision asks the same question. Does this reinforce the old identity or the new one? Training happens in moments that feel insignificant. What you do when you are tired, what you choose when no one is watching, what you tolerate when it would be easier not to. These moments train the mind faster than any affirmation. The fourth element of training is emotional regulation, not emotional suppression, regulation. Emotions are signals. they are not orders. Most people obey emotion. Training means listening without submission. When fear appears, you do not panic. You acknowledge it, and you proceed anyway. This teaches the mind something critical. Fear does not control behavior. That lesson, repeated enough times, changes everything. The fifth element is consistency without drama. The mind does not respond to intensity, it responds to frequency. Small disciplined actions repeated daily outperform dramatic efforts done occasionally. This is why people fail after inspirational moments. They rely on peaks. The mind learns from averages. Training the mind means showing up even when it feels ordinary, especially when it feels ordinary. This is where attraction shifts quietly, not through force, through alignment. As the mind retrains, behavior stabilizes, reaction slows, decision-making sharpens, and life begins to respond differently. Not suddenly, subtly. Opportunities appear that would have gone unnoticed before. Boundaries strengthen. Patterns break. Not because the world changed, because you did. Training the mind also requires patience. Not passive patience, active patience. The patience to repeat, the patience to interrupt, the patience to return to discipline after setbacks. Setbacks are not failure, they are part of retraining. The mind tests consistency. It checks whether this is temporary or real. Miss a day, the mind notices. Miss many, the old training returns. This is not punishment. It is conditioning. Training also means protecting your environment. You cannot train clarity in chaos. What you consume matters. What you listen to, what you read, what you expose yourself to daily. Your environment trains you even when you are passive. So training the mind means curating input intentionally. Less noise, less comparison, less emotional contamination, more silence, more structure, more deliberate reflection. Silence is especially important because silence reveals training. In silence, old thoughts surface. Old patterns reveal themselves. Most people avoid silence for this reason. It exposes the mind, but exposure is necessary for retraining. In silence, you notice where the mind goes automatically. That is where training is needed most. Training the mind is not about control. It is about direction. You choose the direction and you return to it daily. Attraction follows direction, not desire. The life you attract begins to reflect the mind you are training, not immediately, but inevitably. And here is the most important shift. Training the mind does not eliminate difficulty. It changes your relationship to it. Difficulty becomes information. Pressure becomes refinement. Challenges become tests of alignment. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What does this require of me?" That question trains strength. At this stage, many people notice something surprising. They feel calmer, not because life is easier, but because the internal chaos has reduced. Clarity is attractive, not excitement. As training deepens, you stop needing constant reassurance. You stop chasing validation. You stop needing certainty before acting. You trust the process because you trust yourself. This is when attraction becomes natural, not forced, not desperate. You are no longer trying to attract a different life. You are becoming the kind of mind that produces it. This is the difference that changes everything. In the final block, we will explore what happens when this training reaches a critical point. The point of no return, where the old identity no longer fits, where drift becomes impossible, where attraction is no longer accidental. This is where integration happens, and where the life you attract begins to feel inevitable. There comes a moment in every real transformation that does not feel like victory. It feels like certainty. Quiet, uncelebrated, unnoticed by most, but irreversible. This is the point of no return. Not the moment where life suddenly becomes easier, not the moment where everything works, but the moment where drifting becomes impossible. Up until now, change may have felt optional. You could engage, you could pause, you could return to old habits without much resistance. At the point of no return, that changes. Not because you are forcing discipline, but because your identity has shifted. You no longer try to be different. You no longer hope to think differently. You simply do. This is the difference between effort and embodiment. Effort requires energy. Embodiment requires alignment. Most people never reach this point, not because they are incapable, but because they mistake intensity for transformation. They expect fireworks. They expect motivation. They expect emotion. But real change does not announce itself, it settles. At the point of no return, something subtle happens. Your internal dialogue changes tone, not content, tone. Thoughts still appear, fear still visits, doubt still whispers, but none of them feel urgent anymore. They have lost authority. You no longer feel the need to argue with your mind. You listen, you decide, you move. This is when self-trust replaces self-control. You no longer need to monitor every reaction because your default has changed. Default state is everything. It is what you return to when tired, when stressed, when distracted. For most people, default is chaos. For someone who has crossed the point of no return, default is direction. Direction does not mean certainty. It means coherence. Your thoughts begin to align around purpose. Your decisions reference identity. Your actions reflect intention. This is when attraction becomes stable, not because you are doing something special, but because you are no longer contradicting yourself internally. Internal contradiction is what repels. Clarity attracts. At the point of no return, you stop measuring progress by outcomes alone. You measure it by response. How did I respond under pressure? Did I choose discipline over impulse? Did I act in alignment with who I'm becoming? These questions become your compass, not emotion, not approval. This is when life begins to feel different, not dramatically, but consistently. You stop reacting to every inconvenience. You stop internalizing every setback. You stop personalizing every delay. You understand something most people never grasp. Life is not against you, it is responding to you. At the point of no return, responsibility no longer feels heavy. It feels grounding. You no longer ask, why is this happening to me? You ask, what is this asking of me? That question creates strength. Strength does not come from avoiding difficulty. It comes from meeting it without fragmentation. This is why people who have crossed this point often appear calm. Not because they are passive, but because they are integrated. Integration means your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer fighting each other. They are aligned. Alignment creates momentum, not urgency. Momentum is quiet, but unstoppable. At this stage, many people notice an unexpected shift. Their external life begins to reflect their internal order. Relationships change. Not because others changed, but because boundaries did. Opportunities appear. Not because luck improved, but because perception sharpened. Challenges still come, but they no longer destabilize identity. You stop fearing failure, not because you believe you won't fail, but because failure no longer threatens who you are. This is the freedom most people seek without knowing it. Freedom from internal negotiation, freedom from self-betrayal, freedom from constant doubt. At the point of no return, you stop waiting to feel ready. You act from principle. You stop asking for permission from others, from fear, from the past. This is not arrogance. It is ownership. Ownership of your mind, ownership of your attention, ownership of your direction, and ownership changes everything you attract. You no longer chase outcomes. You create conditions. Life responds to conditions, not wishes. This is why attraction becomes inevitable at this stage, not magical, mechanical. Your presence changes. People feel it. Not because you are louder, but because you are clearer. You speak with less urgency. You listen with more patience. You move with intention. These qualities are rare, and rarity attracts. You no longer need to convince. You no longer need to prove. You no longer need to rush. Your mind has been trained not to avoid difficulty, but to navigate it. This is where most people misunderstand success. They think success is the absence of struggle. It is not. Success is coherence under pressure. At the point of no return, pressure becomes a filter. It reveals alignment. What does not fit falls away. People, habits, environments, not through conflict, through incompatibility. This can feel lonely at first because you no longer resonate with what once felt normal. But loneliness is temporary. Clarity attracts connection. Eventually, you encounter people who recognize your steadiness, not because you announced it, but because they feel it. This is how influence works, not through persuasion, through embodiment. You become an example without teaching, a reference point without preaching. This is the highest form of leadership. At the point of no return, you understand something profound. Your life is not shaped by what you desire. It is shaped by what you practice. And you are now practicing alignment daily, quietly, consistently. This does not guarantee comfort. It guarantees integrity. And integrity is the foundation of a meaningful life. You stop asking, what if this doesn't work? And start asking, what kind of person does this require me to be? That question refines you. Refinement is not glamorous, but it is powerful. Over time, the gap between who you are and what you attract closes, not because the world changed, but because contradiction ended. This is the real promise, not a perfect life, but a coherent one. At the point of no return, you trust yourself, not because you know everything, but because you know how you respond. And once a person trusts themselves under pressure, they become very difficult to break. Your mind no longer drifts, it orients. Your attention no longer scatters, it aligns. Your life no longer feels accidental, it feels intentional. This is what it means to train your mind to attract the life you want. Not by chasing outcomes, but by becoming congruent with them. And now you understand the quiet truth beneath everything you've heard. You were never broken. You were never unlucky. You were never incapable. You were trained. And now you are retraining yourself. That changes everything. Not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably. Because once the mind crosses this threshold, there is no going back to drifting, and that is the point of no return.